hand up in your actual hand or your virtual hand if you're watching from home, and I'll bring you into the conversation. Sort of towards the sort of second half of the conversation, I'm going to come to Richard Angell from the Terrence Higgins Trust, who's joining from home. I'm not sure where you are in the country, Richard, but there are specific things that the Terrence Higgins Trust, who is a partner through our Tortoise Community Network, are working on about ending new cases of HIV in the UK before, in advance of the target, before 2030, and he's talked to Richard about how that's going to happen. But before that, we're going to, thank you, branded microphone, everyone. No expense spared. I don't know if you've noticed the iPad as well. But if you, before we get to Richard, the reason why Dave Taylor, my colleague, is sitting up here with me is because I hope that you've had a chance to listen to our Slow Newscast this week. It's called Wrong Turn, and it tells the story of a man called John Crilly, who is the one and only person, I think I'm right in saying, who was convicted through the law called joint enterprise, which is a piece of legislation that enables people to be convicted for very serious crimes, even though they weren't the person that committed those crimes, but because they were party to those crimes in some way. And he's the only person whose conviction through this law has been overturned. And that's the story of the podcast. And when we were prepping for this evening, and I was saying to Dave, what questions are we asking? What are we trying to find out? I suddenly realised, well, Dave knows all about this, so maybe you can do a better job of it than me. So there you go. Dave, tell us first of all a little bit about the story as it stands at the moment, and then you can kind of take it away with what happens next.
Well, so the podcast, if you get a chance to listen to it, it's really the story of a man's life as much as it's the story of a miscarriage of justice, and a systemic one at that. It's in part you just taken on a journey through his upbringing, through his descent into addiction after a family bereavement, and really into this sort of pretty miserable existence he has of addiction and crime and prison. But he gets caught up in a burglary, which he tries to prevent from unfolding, and it all goes a bit wrong. And let's do two microphones. And so he finds himself in this appalling situation where an old man is murdered in his home with a single punch, and John is in a different room when it happens. But as Liz says, under the doctrine of joint enterprise, he is swept up in it, and he is convicted of murder. But the crucial thing that everyone might have a sort of distant memory of is a 2016 Supreme Court ruling, which was in a case called JENGbA, and in that case, the justices, led by Justice Neuberger, ruled that, in fact, the courts had been taking a wrong, as they put it, a wrong turn for 32 years. They had been misinterpreting the law, and that this case was not safe. Everyone imagined that what would happen next is the floodgates would open, and that there'd be a string of successful appeals. But there was a sort of little-known sort of bit of grit really in the judgment, which was that it had this phrase, substantial injustice, and there was a test set for people when they were going to appeal. They had to demonstrate substantial injustice had occurred before they could go forward. And you might think that, well, if you've been locked up for 20 years or thereabouts for murder and you didn't deal the blow, that might be substantial injustice, but apparently that is not the test, but no one really knows what the test is. Anyway, I'll leave the rest of the story because John's life takes an extraordinary turn as well once he is ultimately released. But he stands as the only person who has been successful in having his conviction ruled unsafe since that judgment in 2016. And the astonishing thing is that, you know, the organisation, the campaign group JENGbA, which stands for Joint Enterprise, Not Guilty by Association, has got 1,500 cases on its books. And, you know, there's a lot of people serving very long sentences for murder or manslaughter, often in cases where they didn't wield the weapon in some cases, they were not even there and were unaware that the violence had taken place. So it's an astonishing situation, but it feels rather like one where the system is quite unwilling to live with the enormity of the mistake that it's presided over.
So Dave, that question, I know John is here in the telly.
Yes.
And Jan and a few other people from JENGbA are here to sort of try and help us unpack this, because what we said when we started Tortoise was that we would, stay interested in these stories, that our job wasn't to kind of go, here's the story, and then that's it, tootle off and find something else. We kind of want to stick with it and see what happens next. You've outlined the grit in the ruling. Is that a good place to start in terms of what that means and what we know now? Yeah,
what exactly does that rather elastic phrase, substantial injustice, mean? What's the hurdle people have to get over? It's a huge question for people who are looking at this.
Who might be able to help us answer it, do you think, Jan?
I've got a very good feeling that if Jan Cunliffe's on the call, she's one of the co-chairs of JENGbA, and she had a personal burning reason to be a campaigner. If she's on the call, it would be brilliant to hear from her on the conundrum.
Let's see if we can find Jan Cunliffe. Yeah, let's try
Jan's iPhone.
Yeah, yeah, I'm here.
We'll take any Jan.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Will you turn up the volume on the telly, please?
How are we doing, Jan?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can now,
yeah. Yeah, I'm good, thank you. I'm good, thank you. Yeah, thanks for this. Don't ask me to explain the substantial injustice test, because that's I can't.
Right.
Yeah, I mean the best way to explain it is if let's say, for instance, if someone went to trial now and they were convicted now under the right law, and they wanted to go to the Court of Appeal, there is a test that you have to pass. And let's just say that test, let's use the example that it's something that you've got to jump over. So if you have to go to the Court of Appeal now, you have to jump over something that's a metre high. So it's already a high test. However, if you were convicted before 2016, not only do you have to jump over that metre high test that everyone else has to jump over, you also have to jump over a second one, which is a substantial injustice test, and that one's 3 meters high. So you're less likely to be able to sort of get a chance to the Court of Appeal if you were convicted under the wrong law.
And Jan, you've really tried hard, haven't you, to establish, well, what do authorities understand by that phrase? And you've not got any answers, have you?
Just that it's a barrier, that's an impossible barrier to get over, and that it was deliberately put there. I mean, when we first got the judgment and we were all excited about it, we didn't realise that this extra piece had been put into that judgment to stop people from going to the Court of Appeal. But Gloria went to, I don't know where it was, but one of the judges who was at the Supreme Court was doing a talk, and I think it was Lord Toulson, and she asked him, why did he put substantial injustice in there? Why did the judges put that in there? What was the reason? And he said it was because he didn't want the media and the red tops to sort of come down on the judges as if they were going to let murderers out. So it was for their own self-preservation. They were looking after their own reputations rather than looking at justice. They didn't want the Murdoch press, if you like, to say, look at all of these people, hundreds of people, they're letting murderers out onto the streets, when in actual fact, the people we support are not murderers anyway. And the courts know they're not murderers, but they didn't want to take that from the mainstream media and then have the public thinking that that's what had happened.
I would hate to let politicians off the hook as well, because, well, first, I think the first thing to say is it's not only the Murdoch press, but it's right across the media, the sort of tropes of walk free and, soft on crime are there right across the media. But also, I think when you cover home affairs issues for a while, you keep seeing this terrible swirling sort of miasma really of, courts, politicians and the media all sort of terrified of each other and all doing laps of the same plug hole really, and their priorities are not about trying to make people useful citizens. They're about trying to avoid bad headlines and career-ending scandals, and it does feel that you see it again and again. So I suppose there's one question that it feels like our further inquiry needs to answer is, albeit your co-chair Gloria seems to have got an answer out of one of the judges from the horse's mouth. It does seem like we need a satisfactory answer to what that test is. But then I think further to that, I know that you guys are working on a private members bill, aren't you? Because you think there's a part of the law that needs to change. And am I right in thinking that Charlotte might be on the call, yeah. Charlotte Henry?
Yes, because Charlotte's drafted the private members bill, so she's been brilliant and sort of drafted that herself. She's done the consultation with.
If she's there,
yeah, so if she's there, she's better
Hello.
equipped to explain it.
There she is. Charlotte, thanks for joining
Hi.
us. You join us from South London?
I am, yeah, near Richmond.
Excellent. Now, I read an interview with you a few weeks ago, and there's this immortal line in it. I mean, it's a terrible story. Your brother has been jailed in these circumstances, but this immortal line from you in a quote where it says, "As soon as I heard the verdict, I thought, oh crap, I'm going to have to become a lawyer." And I wonder if you could just talk us through that sentiment before you get stuck into what you've done.
Well, I really enjoyed law. I wanted to be a lawyer since I was 11, and I had done a law degree before my brother was charged with murder. I just didn't do very well. Like, I partied too much, so I got a 2-2 and resigned myself to going in somewhere else in like a criminal justice job. And watching kind of the injustice play out at my brother's trial, I thought, well, I could probably do that. I understand everything. I probably could do it. And then I kind of kicked myself for not taking my career as seriously as I should have done when I was doing my undergrad. So yeah, and at the time I also thought it's better to know your enemy. If you're going to fight something, you have to know everything about it. So I thought, well, I'm going to have to become a lawyer to help my brother.
Would you mind just telling us briefly about Alex's case and where he is currently, and then just tell us what the private members bill is all about?
Sure. So my brother, he was out shopping on a Tuesday afternoon in August 2013. He was shopping with 3 other friends. He came out of a shop with one friend and he saw his other friend across the road being circled by a group of 4 other men. He ran in because he saw his friend was holding a bottle, a wine bottle by its neck, and he could see that the other 4 members of the group had taken off their belts to use as weapons. Didn't recognize any of them. Both groups were strangers to each other. But from seeing that, he knows something's going off. There's going to be a fight. Something's happened. So he runs in, and as he runs in, the violence erupts around him. Now, the boy that he ran out of a shop with, that he had known for only 6 months, had a knife in his bag and used that knife to stab 2 people during the course of the fight. The fight lasted 47 seconds. There was violence on both parts, but both sides of the fight. My brother threw a punch at one person after the fatal stab wound had been inflicted, and he threw a mobile phone before the fatal stab wound had been inflicted. We can see this because within about 20 seconds, the victims would have been stabbed because the stabber runs off in a completely different direction and then isn't seen for another couple of hours. So yeah, it was a spontaneous fight. Both groups were strangers, broad daylight, and my brother was charged with murder. He stood trial at the Old Bailey in March 2014, along with the boy who held the bottle of wine, and alongside both of his 2 friends. And on the 12th of March 2014, my brother was convicted of murder along with 2 other people. The person that actually inflicted the fatal stab wounds, he pled guilty and accepted full responsibility. My brother was said to be guilty because the law that existed at the time said you don't have to intend the murder yourself or know that the murder will happen. It is enough that you just foresee it. That law, as you guys know, changed in 2016, but we have to pass a substantial injustice test, which is a very, very high and onerous legal bar. And that's what our private members bill is geared towards abolishing, basically.
And you've drafted it, to be clear.
Yeah, I have. I got help though. So Felicity Gary QC, she's an excellent QC. She gave me lots of advice. We also did a consultation period, and we sent out a survey to academics across the UK, leading academics from like Cambridge and Oxford, and they all ripped apart what I had written. So we kind of, it was really great actually. So the substantial injustice test that I had written, I renamed it the ill effects test, because substantial injustice is not a test that's only being applied to us. It's actually a test that's applied whenever there's been a change of the law and someone wants to appeal beyond 28 days, because when you've been convicted of a crime, you only have 28 days to appeal that conviction. Right. And if you're appealing and also based on a change in the law, then you have to pass substantial injustice. So the substantial injustice test has been interpreted in very different ways. Some people only need to prove that they're still suffering the consequences of the conviction, so a high insurance premium, they might be being monitored in the community, they might be banned from driving, things like that. We have to prove that we're innocent of the crime. That's what substantial injustice means, or demonstrate that we're very, very, very likely to be innocent. But the innocence of the crime is the test. The ambiguity around it with us is whether you have to be very likely to be innocent, probably innocent. It has to be at least probably. That seems to be the wording so far. But in other cases, continuing effects test. So that I said, we want to apply the same kind of continuing effects test, because it's unfair that they get to show that they're still suffering the consequences of the conviction, whereas we're all in prison, life sentences for murder when we shouldn't be. That's obviously a very, very serious consequence, their life sentences. But it was the reason that we would automatically prove that we're still suffering the consequences of the conviction, that they told us that we had to prove our innocence. So that's why we have to pass the really high test.
So you've just demonstrated that you should have got at least a 2-1, I think. And I suppose the real dumb question is, if you, having framed that private members bill, in the unlikely event that it went through the process, somebody takes it up in the Commons and it passes. I know they don't normally. Would it have the effect of ending the injustice of that 1,500 and some people still sitting in prison?
Absolutely. So what it actually does is it creates a statutory mechanism for appeal. We don't have a statutory mechanism for appeal in change of law cases. The substantial injustice test was a common law judge-made test. And what we're asking for is parity. So everyone else that gets to pass the consequences test, they get a right to have their appeal, and usually a successful appeal. We don't get that. So we're asking for pretty much the same test that they have, but we're asking for it to be legislated.
Okay, well, I mean, you're doing really noble work, and I know you mentioned earlier that you visited with Alex yesterday in prison. So I know there's a deeply personal element to this too, that we all, I suppose, hope to send you a bit of support.
Thank you.
In your efforts. I suppose one of the other questions that I have, Liz, is, and I don't know the answer to, is what's happening in the courts now, is because some people are still being convicted under joint enterprise. So I think that's a thread. And then the other thing that is sort of stunning in this, if we talk about a cohort of about 1,500 cases that are on JENGbA's books, there are subsets, young black men disproportionately represented. It's used as a sort of tool to, sweep up so-called gang culture. And women in coercive relationships as well. There are 109 women, at least, serving long sentences under joint enterprise who were identified by a report last year from Manchester Metropolitan Academics. And within that, these figures are amazing. There's 90% of the women had no involvement in the violence and 50% of them weren't there. It's just... Sorry,
James wants to come in. But on that, so 109 women serving who've been convicted on a joint enterprise. What's that got to do with the coercive relationships thing?
Well, so I think that what the academics would say is that's a common trait of these cases, that it's often a woman who's in an abusive relationship, or it's a relationship where there's drugs at the back of it, let's say,
right? And
so someone might be present but nothing to do with the case, or someone might have been seen to have there's a case that people talk about where a woman supposedly lures someone to a scene with a Facebook message, thinking that they're going to get robbed by their boyfriend, and in fact the boyfriend kills them, and then right. That's what happens next.
James.
I was James, well, actually maybe the jam shot, I don't know. So if you thought about actually campaigning, the question you asked is when did it go?
Yeah.
So part of that is when did it start? There have been all these arguments around joint enterprise that it started because it was sort of convenient for the police. There was a certain, if you like, Home Office police wish to say that we can't convict all these people. They were all in the crime. Let's boundary people up. So I don't know where it goes in that sense, where the origins, who the advocates, because that will also tell you who you're going to be up against if you try to campaign against it. Yeah. There's a second thing which I also don't know, which is that it's one thing to say, okay, there are 109 women. The fact in your podcast, Dave, about the disproportionate conviction and incarceration of black men. Yeah. The question you've got there is, okay, well, who are going to be the cases that are going to be your bad cases to campaign? One case we've got here is John Pruitt. He's a white man, I don't know if John's on.
Yeah, he is.
That's the minority of cases in this. And I suppose the real other question is who your allies. So I'm struck by the fact that Sean's talking about a private members bill, but who would actually come on board?
Yeah. Well, I think I suppose one heartening thing is for campaigners, David Lammy, who's the Shadow Justice Secretary, was at their last rally in August, and he said if he was in government, he would legislate in the way that Charlotte has described. So there's him at least. Somebody asked me the question yesterday, wondering whether it was where it was on Dominic Raab's list of priorities as Justice Secretary, and I imagine he doesn't even know it exists at this point.
John Crilly is on and has just responded to some of James's questions briefly. If we can hear from John, are you there? Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you. I was just saying you've responded in the chat to some of the questions James and Dave were asking about what happens today in the courts. It's a sort of slightly, it's called a different thing, but the outcome is the same. Just explain that a little bit.
Well, I've literally sat on a couple of trials since I've been out, obviously since the ruling in Manchester, and it's basically just exactly the same narrative, but like they're very good at, they have loads of rules of interpretation, rules of language, rules to apply the law. They can just basically twist it any way they want. Obviously, I've done a law degree myself, just a little one. And to me, it's just all nonsense. It's just made to bamboozle us, and that's what they do. Today in the courts, they're still using, like, if there's a girl in the dock, straight away the police are threatening to take the kids, putting words in their mouths, and it gets read out in court. It actually gets read out this in court over and over again, and the judge just like goes right over their heads, and I'm thinking, this is crazy. Don't no one care? It's just nuts. The way they get these convictions. So yeah, they're still doing it today, but just use different language. And substantial injustice test is just a joke. That was, I researched that on my degree as well, and that precedent comes from back in the dueling days. Just to basically, first case it was ever used in was related to driving offences. So they applied the law wrong in driving offences, where the ultimate sanction would be about 12 months. So they took that test, that precedent, and applied it to this, where you're talking about the sanctions here are up to 35, 40 years for kids of 17, 18 years of age. It's just disproportionate. It just boggles my mind. And people must think we're all chatting shit. We're not. This is all true. This is all facts.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John. It's nice to see your face. We've heard your voice in the podcast. It's nice to see your face as well. Dave, do you feel like you've got a clear editorial, to-do list of where we need to go next with this, or not?
I think, well, I do know that there's a study being done by the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies that's looking at what's happening in the courts now and trying to be empirical about that. I think they're about halfway through 15 months. I would quite like to get alongside them and see what they've already found. Yeah. I think that's a we should care about that. Yeah. We should care about the legislative end of things, and then I do think that it's anyone who's listened to the podcast, it's a pretty I'm not going to lie, it's pretty exhausting. It's quite a grueling thing to listen to, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do more of the human stories behind it, because I think.
That's what I don't understand with the story. You said there was a panorama, wasn't there? Sorry, there was a panorama
in 2009. Yeah.
2009.
Yeah.
And there was a way that people worried about this.
Yes.
Then there's the Supreme Court. So I don't understand.
Well, I wonder if, Jan could probably take that on for us, but I think it was, I think for most interested, sentient people who were watching along, they thought that injustice had been resolved in 2016 with the Supreme Court. And it's only when, you're at the coalface, as it were, that you realise that, well, it didn't happen. Jan, I don't know if are you still with us? Would you, you probably can say that a lot more engagingly than I can.
Yeah.
Hey, Jan.
Yeah, I think the judgment from 2016 only touched on one element of the problem with joint enterprise, and that was the possibility of foresight. There is a lot more that needs to be done to the law as well, because with all of these cases, the evidence, the burden of proof is so low. It's almost non-existent. If it was a murder trial and it was one person on trial, the burden of proof would be very heavy, and you'd have to have concrete evidence, and everything would have to be beyond all reasonable doubt. But when it comes to a multiple-handed case, the rules are completely different. Joint enterprise makes it a completely different ballgame altogether. So just being present at the scene can be classed as being encouragement, assisting in encouraging. So, just being stood there and you're not actually shouting anything, not saying anything, just your presence is enough to say, the prosecution will say that is you encouraging a murder because you're there.
Sorry to interrupt your flow. As a campaigner on the issue, what's the one thing that you're pushing for tomorrow?
I think the big thing for us as a campaign is obviously the substantial injustice test, because the people who are already convicted need to have some hope that they will get back to the Court of Appeal, because they were all convicted on very, very loose evidence in the first place. But I think a really important thing for people to realise is that if we're going to continue to use joint enterprise, then we need to raise the burden of evidence. We need to raise the burden of proof. We can't just have inferences and possibilities, very, very loose evidence. It's not enough, because people are going to prison. It's a life sentence. You know, you can't use weak evidence and then expect people to get a life sentence for murder. And I think a lot of the juries don't realise in these cases, they know who the perpetrator is. So when they then find the secondary parties guilty, I don't think the juries actually realise that the secondary party is also going to get a life sentence for murder as well, because people just don't understand it.
And then there's new thing highlighted again, and it seems like this structure is like it doesn't get written in. And I'm really conscious that I do want to hear from Richard, but there are two more people who are making contributions that would be interesting. John Alexander is there on the big telly. John, are you there? Hopefully we can hear John Alexander. If you can find him. Hi, John. Oh, you're in the dark. Oh.
Try and rectify that. It's been going dark behind me. Sorry, Liz.
Resplendent, John. Yes, tell us, you're sort of commenting on this, an underlying mindset that might be creating these disparities. Just tell us what you're thinking.
I was just picking up on what Dave was saying actually about the chasing around the same plug hole and the culture of I guess trying to be seen to be hard on things as much as possible, and just, it's something I've come across recently. I've been I was in touch with a guy called Zach Norris, who's written a book called We Keep Us Safe, and I was actually just scrambling in response to James Wilson challenge, asking me what the main recommendations in the book are. I was scrambling to find my copy and be able to post the main shifts for you. But essentially Zach's argument is that what you have in the criminal justice system in the States at the moment in particular, but arguably also true here, is exactly that, like a culture that is driven more politically than anything by trying to appear tough on crime, rather than a culture that's driven by what Zach talks about as a shift from a culture of fear to a culture of care, and from deprivation to resources. So schemes that try and invest in people and see them and explicitly see the means to the end being involving people in society and unlocking the potential contribution, rather than being seen to clamp down as hard as possible for sort of macho points. I'll try and find a bit more and get in the chat. It's helpful.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think that understanding it definitely feels like here when Jan talks and when John talks and a couple of other people who are close to this in the chat, you can feel a sort of, well, there's just, and the statistics which says there's a sort of creeping suspicion that there's a sort of ideological basis to this.
Through the justice system, and I think unfortunately there have been a couple of surprisingly enlightened Tory Justice Secretaries who have said all of the right things about crime and punishment, and that we lock up too many people and we ought to be more progressive, spend our money better. And then Boris Johnson comes along and he's just, he's like, his only experience of the prison system is watching a few episodes of Porridge or something.
Yeah. Okay, so we are at 7:05. Do we feel like we're ready to move on to item 2 on the agenda? Is that good for you, Dave? Do you feel like you've got what you need? We've got a good list of things there. I'm going to come to Lara, if I can see it. Where was she? Oh, she's there. I did that in a meeting the other day. We used to see right next to her. Where's Lara? She's invisible to me. Hi, Lara. Hello. Just briefly, this is a big week. I know we talked a little bit about this on Twitter Spaces, I think it was yesterday. But would you mind just telling us, vaccine arms race is a summit tomorrow. Just give us a sense of everything through the summer has coming up to tomorrow, really, in a way.
Sure. So since June at Tortoise, we've obviously been campaigning for kind of global vaccine equity on the grounds that wealthy nations' vaccines far higher numbers than low-income countries are. And this week is kind of a massive crunch point in the combination of a lot of our efforts and efforts among the wider coalition of partners and efforts among people pushing for this internationally, in that Biden has actually called for an emergency vaccine summit at the UN General Assembly, and that's happening tomorrow. So he's invited not just leaders of kind of these wealthy stockpiling nations that have huge numbers of surplus doses, but also various philanthropic organisations, other campaigners. He's asked them to submit a video, a kind of 90-second video about how they'll improve vaccine equity. He's asked them to pledge 1 billion doses to contribute money into a pot for assisting in financing. That's happening tomorrow. We, in addition to the Financial Times letter that we signed a couple of weeks ago, will be like sort of re-upping that and pushing that out, and the kind of data work that the wider teams that Kim and others have been doing will be pushed out again too. So tomorrow is a like massive day for whether or not this is possible. Obviously, there are other different pressure points where we can put kind of a greater deal of pressure on leaders. So the G20 Rome in October, or COP later on in the year. But this tomorrow will be kind of Biden's big effort to kind of get other global leaders that have huge numbers of doses to kind of put around him. He's also been negotiating a kind of massive Pfizer deal with an extra 500 million doses for low-income countries. We've still not heard whether or not he's going to be able to secure that, but if he does, it will mean that the Biden administration will have about over 1 billion doses that it will be able to give to low-income countries, which would be fantastic and would cover about 1/10 of the world's need. But we're probably unlikely to hear it before the summit, which means we're probably unlikely to get a really big push in the way that we wanted in that too. And I've not seen any country up their commitment as a result of this summit being called. We don't even know who's going to be going tomorrow, so it's kind of all in the air whether or not it will be successful, and the kind of wider press haven't been covering it that remarkably either. So we're hoping there'll be a big commitment. There was a kind of intervention by the OECD, I think it was today or yesterday, talking about how kind of low vaccination rates in low-income countries are affecting the global economy at large. And those are the kind of arguments sometimes that resonate a bit more with wealthy leaders than the kind of classic arguments of basic justice and being able to save lives. So hopefully it will make a difference tomorrow, but really there's been fairly little reporting out of it, and kind of fairly little insight into how it's going to go. So the Biden administration don't seem to be particularly hopeful, but it's it's incredibly important, and one of these ones where the case just makes itself.
Yeah. Do people know? Were you aware of the fact that there was this big vaccine summit happening tomorrow? I only know because Lara told me yesterday, but I think you're right in that it's not been a huge amount of media fanfare about it. I was sort of under the radar a bit.
It's definitely been under the radar. I mean, obviously there's a lot going on in the world, as there always is.
Yeah.
There's kind of the big Australia security pact, which is getting a lot of coverage, kind of double backs, Britain's, etc. So there's a lot going on already. So, but this is one of those big issues which I think people are less sure about, and the kind of booster debate, which is threatens to kind of eclipse all of it, and this sort of wider disagreement within this kind of community of kind of pro-vaccine advocates, of kind of the WHO, who have said that their chief scientist said quite explicitly that he doesn't think there's enough doses to give boosters and to help vaccinate them.
That's not true though, is it?
Kind of The Economist and other analysis suggests that actually, no, we have such vast stockpiles, hundreds of millions of spare doses, enough that we actually can do both, and we can roll out a booster program in addition to giving these doses. So something the Biden administration is calling for tomorrow is to kind of not just add to the commitments of doses that we've already offered, but to speed up the pace at which they get there, because it's not a supply crisis. Doses exist, right?
Do they have a use-by date?
They do have a use-by date, yeah. But I mean, and there is.
It'd be helpful if it was really soon. Do you know what I mean?
Well, unfortunately, for quite a few of them, it is, and there is this kind of. I mean, something the Blair Institute have done a lot of work on is absorption capacity. So it will get to a point next year, by which point an excess of around 2 million people are likely to have died as a result of us not giving them necessary doses. But it will get to a point next year where we have such an excess of this supply that there will be many wasted doses, and there will be countries that don't necessarily have the distribution or infrastructure capacity to be administering these doses in the quantities that they want, who will be receiving too many at one time, will be unable to plan. And something that our colleague Paul wrote about in his dispatch from Tunisia was that question. It's really impossible for many of these countries, and we saw it in Afghanistan as well, to plan their kind of vaccine program if they don't know when they're getting doses for. And because COVAX has been so undersupplied and has had problems of its own, and because we're not giving in the numbers that we should be or as regularly as we should be, it's impossible for countries to actually be able to administer these doses. But they're getting coverage often saying, well, some of your doses are going to waste, or they're forecast to go to waste.
Yeah.
And it's really not their fault at all. It's the fault of the international community who have absolutely failed to deliver.
So it's not do or die tomorrow, exactly.
It's not do or die,
but
obviously it is do or die in the sense that not hundreds of thousands will die before G20 in Rome, and there's no guarantee that in Rome we'll come up with an
hang on, when's the G20? How long in time?
In October.
Okay, so like a few weeks later. Yeah. And we will hear from the summit tomorrow as to whether there's been an agreement or a set of agreements, or will it take a longer time than that to filter out?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the problems with tomorrow's summit is that there's no formal accountability mechanism that's in place. There's no, apart from the Biden administration, there's no clear leadership or accountability on this. And obviously, we've done a tracker which looks, I think, very effectively at where countries have promised those and delivered them. But that the Biden administration has pulled for is like a very, very thorough kind of global data tracker, which is used as an accountability mechanism and able to kind of almost sanction people who aren't fulfilling their promise, because we've had these promises since June, if not before.
Yeah.
And countries just aren't giving doses when they should be.
Yeah. Okay, well, we'll fingers crossed for tomorrow, and thank you very much. It's always nice to hear an update on what's happening with that campaign. I'm going to go now, if I can, to Richard Angell, who is here from the Terrence Higgins Trust I mentioned at the beginning. If we can find you, Richard. Hello.
Good evening.
Hello.
Thank you for having me along today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you, and thanks very much for waiting till we got here. I mean, we're all virologists now. We've been trained for a year and a half to know everything there is to know. But your particular virus that you're interested in, obviously, is HIV, and you've got a ton of, well, I think exciting things to talk to us about, specifically ending new cases of HIV. I'm old enough to remember when this felt like a really, really big, pressing, urgent, frightening problem in this country. It still is in other parts of the world. But just tell us where the Terrence Higgins Trust is at now with this.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me along to this. I think people living with HIV feel that this is a virus that's been forgotten, an epidemic here that is being too often ignored. And we know that this is the place to come to, a media outlet that can turn a dispute in the Embroiderers Guild into an episode of The West Wing. And,
You're welcome.
and as you saw with the kind of previous discussion, isn't scared of the passion that comes with the fight for injustice in this field. And people who campaign on HIV are very passionate, like Jan was in the previous one. So thank you for indulging us and taking this on board. So it's weird to say there's a kind of excitement around the issue of HIV because it continues to blight so many lives, particularly globally. And the reason why we are coming out of COVID so quickly, and I know it doesn't feel like that, but is actually built on the science that has been there looking for a looking for a vaccine for HIV, which we've still been unable to secure. But that, most of the COVID response has been built on that. But in the year before COVID hit, 1.8 billion was taken out globally from the global response to HIV and AIDS. And we, our own government has cut its funding to UNAIDS by 80% in the last year. So, these things act as global phenomena in the same way that we know COVID to have done. The reason why we're coming out of COVID relatively quickly is because of the investment in HIV/AIDS. Every bit of that was fought for because homophobia and racism held back governments and agencies from doing what they needed to find out about HIV/AIDS early enough and substantively enough. And to see the response to COVID be one taking away the response to HIV globally is really saddening. We, however, are a domestic HIV and sexual health charity, and our primary focus is on the scientific possibility in a country like ours of ending new cases of HIV. So many people will have seen the show It's a Sin. 1 in 3 households in the country have downloaded at least one episode from all 4. It's been downloaded 25 million times, and I think it was Channel 4's biggest live audience. That in many ways has put HIV back on the agenda, but sadly as a history piece. But we're here to talk about how it's influencing people today, but crucially, how it's changed. For too many people, HIV is captured in those public health adverts that went out in the late 80s, that it was a killer, that it was a danger, that was something to be feared and stigmatized. And that is so different from the experience today. So 105,000 people in the UK are living with HIV. It's a very diverse population of people. It's not the gay plague that many of the Fleet Street press had kind of pinned it as back in the day and holds out as a kind of stubborn view on the issue. About 45% of those diagnosed got it through heterosexual transmission. 45% of those are from a Black African background. 1 in 3 people getting care for HIV are women in the UK. So it's a very diverse epidemic here. Like COVID, it can affect everybody, but like COVID, it disproportionately preys on the inequalities that are already in our system. Where we are now is there's about 7,000 people UK-wide that have undiagnosed HIV, and there are about 7,000 people who have been diagnosed but through a combination of issues, either comorbidities or loss to care, still don't have what we call an undetectable viral load. So those two groups are able to essentially pass on the virus in the system. But we have all the tools to ensure that they can be diagnosed, they can be in care, and everybody living with HIV can't pass on the virus, and therefore we can stop new transmissions. We've been able to win the case domestically for that to be an aspiration. The Welsh government signed up to it in November 2018. The English government signed up to it in January 2019, and the Scottish government signed up to it in December 2020. We've just got a little push in Northern Ireland, but we will get there. So it is now an aspiration in 3 of the 4 UK nations that we will end the epidemic by 2030. Off the back of those pledges, my charity, Terrence Higgins Trust, working with the Elton John AIDS Foundation and the National AIDS Trust, came together with Matt Hancock's endorsement when he was the Health Secretary to create the HIV Commission, reported last World AIDS Day. And not only did it give us a blueprint for meeting that 2030 goal, it actually said we could be the first country in the world to meet that goal and that UNAIDS target and make such a transformation to so many people's lives. In that toolkit is a variety of things. Treatment has come on leaps and bounds. Not only if you were diagnosed within 4 years of transmission, will it have 0 impact on your life chances now because of treatment. That treatment's so effective, it reduces the HIV in your system, so you'd be unable to pass it on to a sexual partner, or if you were to become pregnant, to your fetus. That is an amazing step forward, and something that if you only take one thing away from today, it's to tell somebody else that people on effective HIV treatment can't pass on the virus. That is the tenet of which awful stigma remains, and it is the most important thing to share. The other thing that we have available to us is a drug called PrEP, and this is something that people can take normally once a day, and it means that if HIV were to enter your system, it can't take hold in your system. So with a combination of things available to us, we can stop new transmissions in a country. We can stop them in any country. We have the systems, and we already have the head start to do it in a country like the UK. And we are wanting to hold the government's feet to the fire on their promises. And tomorrow we launch a campaign to get the Chancellor to give this the seed funding that it really needs. And the big interventions that we need, if you think of those 2 groups of 7,000 people, we need opt-out testing in our hospitals. When you go to A&E, when you register at a GP or the hospital's otherwise taking your blood, we need to pop in a HIV test in that. It's really cheap. It's really destigmatizing that it's not kind of singling anybody out, that everybody will be asked to take that test. And that is a great way of finding those diagnoses. The Elton John AIDS Foundation have a pilot in Lambeth, Lewisham and Southwark, and it is transforming outcomes, diagnosing people across our communities, and it diagnosed a woman as old as I believe 86, which was she would otherwise never have been triaged for a HIV test. The other side of that is the investment in getting people back into care. And if we can get that investment in the CSR that the Chancellor has promised on the 27th of October, we can change the system. I'll leave it there and take your questions if that's okay.
For sure. Thanks ever so much, Richard. So just so I make sure I've understood it, 7,000 people undiagnosed.
Yep.
The other 7,000 are diagnosed, but I didn't quite understand the bit you said after that. Diagnosed, but something.
So they basically, they can pass on the virus. So for whatever reason, treatment isn't working. So they've either, they might have had HIV for a long time and got comorbidities and other challenges with it, so that the treatment isn't being completely effective on its own, or they might be lost to care. So one of those groups is that people who are born with HIV will receive their HIV care as children in rooms with Disney characters painted on the walls. The minute they turn 18, they're expected to go to adult sexual health services, and there's other STIs on the walls and stuff about sexual practices that, and all that kind of stuff. That group is sadly lost to care. People move around the country in other kind of ways, or have in some way chaotic lifestyles, and our services haven't responded appropriately. So they're the 2 groups that if we can engage with those and then provide those who are in communities at risk of HIV with the PrEP drug, we can make sure that we end the epidemic here.
It's an odd thing. We did a thinking really early this year about vaccine hesitancy. The COVID vaccine had just started, the UK rollout was just happening, and we talked a lot about communications strategies. Do you remember this, Dave? And what's the combination of carrot and stick, and how do you sort of tackle various different people's attitudinal responses to public health messages? And it's a funny thing that the HIV thing that Richard, this is literally your life, which is there's so much to say that is good news about what has happened, but then you get people kind of going, we don't need to worry about this no more. That's finished. We've done. Move on. We've got bigger fish to fry. But also, you are asking the Chancellor, if I understand right, you need the money unlocked from the Treasury to deliver what the Department for Health and Social Care is already committed to doing. Is that right?
Absolutely.
And and how do you frame how you pitch it? Whether it's we really must do this because otherwise it's terrible, versus, oh my God, we're nearly there. We just need you to help us nudge it over the line. Which is better?
Well, I think it's really exciting that we can pursue an elimination strategy for a virus like this. Yeah. And it's not eliminating people living with HIV. They're an important part of our community and shouldn't experience stigma, and we support them going on to live full and fulfilling lives. But since the HIV/AIDS epidemic hit the UK, the activists have fought so that nobody else got a diagnosis after them. And so that's an exciting place to be. And I think that's really engaged people. And clearly, It's a Sin has put it onto a wider group of people's agenda. And you've seen, the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party wearing our La T-shirt in Parliament, through to ministers taking extra concern. And the previous public health minister who's just been moved jobs, announcing 10,000 extra tests while It's a Sin was free HIV tests while It's a Sin was on the screen, because it was really generating a conversation about HIV. So I think there's a sense of agency by a whole number of people that something quite remarkable that felt unattainable is now within our grasp. And also, I think there's a sense that the government is going to be hosting a conference called Safe to Be Me, which is a global LGBT conference. It's the first of its kind to have this kind of intergovernmental element to it. They've asked Nick Herbert to chair it, and they want some real things to announce there and to show that they are making progress on these issues. HIV/AIDS is still the biggest global killer of gay and bisexual men globally. It's thankfully not a killer here, but it is for too many people. That access to healthcare being universal is really important. And the way we are doing it here is an example to many others, but equally we've got stuff to learn elsewhere. So I think that's another way in which it's on the agenda, is we're about to convene some of the global parties. Health is going to be one of the three streams of that conference going forward. But also we've said to them, you made a promise and we're going to keep you to it. And if you haven't made 80% progress by 2028, we're unlikely to make that 2030 goal of complete elimination.
Yeah, thanks so much, Richard. Kerry, you wanted to come in on this.
Kind of easy with like ambition. Come in being sort of positive and helpful. But I'm just intrigued, because 14,000
I can't hear the question at all, I'm afraid.
Oh, God, keep going, Kerry, and if I need to repeat it, I will. We're having a nightmare. I think it's the tortoise branded microphones. It was fine before we branded them.
I think it's our battery charge. Let me start again, Richard. I said I didn't want to accuse you of a sort of lack of ambition, because you've been helpful and interesting, and I don't want to be rude, but I'm just intrigued why 14,000 people in a country of 65 million seems like a tiny number. You've already got the drugs. Why is it 2030? Why isn't it 2025? Could you fix this quicker if you had the right sort of help and the right sort of commitment?
Arguably, absolutely. There's been global goals set. So the first aim was that by 2020, we would have diagnosed 90% of those living with HIV in country, got 90% of those in treatment, and 90% of those with this undetectable status. The UK met it 2 years early, London even before that. London now has the highest diagnosis rate of any city in any country in the world, which is pretty remarkable. So we are focusing our resources towards that point. We, of course, would like to do it earlier if possible, but it is going to take a corralling of resources. And, of course, unless something big was done very early to get that kind of widespread testing, 7% of people have never had a HIV test in the country. And one of the things that's been so successful about the public health campaigns, and we've run a program for the government for 20 years about targeting the most at-risk communities. But as those have become diagnosed, the proportion of those undiagnosed that broadly sit in the LGBT community or amongst Black African Britons is going down. It's those that are in that wider group, and there's not a kind of public health campaign that you can run to find the estimated 400 to 600 white women across England that are undiagnosed. That would be so it's going to be universal action that is going to diagnose those in that group, which is why we need actions like opt-out testing. We would like it in all hospitals, all GPs, and every time the NHS takes blood, but the world doesn't move like that. So we're going to prioritise the 55 hospitals, an area of high and extremely high prevalence of HIV and undiagnosed HIV, and that's our priority now, because that will get the best bang for the buck.
Phoebe.
Hiya, can you hear me? Is that
Yeah.
all right?
Yes.
Yeah, there we go. So I think you raised a really interesting point about TV, right? And I think I've only been thinking about it because sex education has come back on Netflix, and they have this exact conversation in the show. And
what exact conversation?
So one of the gay students goes to a sexual health clinic, and this is in the context of having abstinence-only homophobics teaching at the school, goes to a sexual health clinic, and the nurse in quite a comedic fashion goes through and says, "You're not going to die of HIV." He was actually having an allergic reaction to a condom, and he was like, "I'm going to die, I'm gay, and I'm going to die from HIV." And she goes, "No, you're not. You can take PrEP. You're fine. You will be fine." And I was sitting there and I went, "Do you know what? I didn't know that." And that's crazy to me. I'm 24, right? So I have been at school, and, you know, I'm a white woman. Why was that not part of my sexual health education? And I've had a HIV test, and I wasn't aware when I had a HIV test that was the possibility. In my head, it was still quite dangerous. And I see why it's a sin, has kind of raised the conversation, but I would also say that it's put quite a bit of fear into people's minds. And I was just really curious about where the line of, and why we should be relying on Netflix and Channel 4 to be putting that education to me over an effective public health campaign.
Everything you need to know you can learn from Netflix. I don't know. So it's a good question though. The short version of what Phoebe raises there is, was the impact of It's a Sin, as you say, a historical drama told a very important and moving story? Was it net negative, really, in terms of HIV and AIDS awareness?
Definitely not. Overwhelmingly not, because it wasn't about educating, it was entertaining. But that entertainment engaged people in this conversation and has raised awareness in a remarkable way, and has had untold benefits into the role of HIV and other cultural elements, the way that actually the LGBT community has re-grabbed hold of that issue, that there's this trauma that's affected our community in our very near past and continues to, but that in some ways that the stigma associated with HIV meant lots of LGBT activists had kind of rejected talk about HIV and wanting it to be in their stable. So in that sense, that's come about. Other communities have been in on the conversation. You know, it gave a nod to the haemophiliacs and those who were affected by contaminated blood products. We currently have the biggest public inquiry ongoing into that issue happening now. The former health secretary was being interviewed just today under oath to go through the kind of minutiae of that issue. But of course, it raised the issue of a global epidemic as well. And you see Roscoe and his family have a nod to the global epidemic. So that's all there. But the challenge that you talked about is the very real challenge in my job. So in 2019, the last normal year we have figures for, 500,000 people proactively went to a sexual health clinic and didn't get offered a HIV test. Half of those were women, and half of those women were Black. And women are much less likely to use a sexual health service. They get their sexual support often from other places than men, and gay men are like to use their services. So it's a real social injustice issue where the provision is. But we have this breakthrough that, you know, Richie and Colin and Ash and Roscoe and all those characters would have bitten their hand off to get PrEP. But we keep it as a national secret. You know, the government had to be forced. Our partners, the National AIDS Trust, took the NHS to court to even provide the drug, because they said they didn't pay for prevention, even though they pay for the pill and all kinds of, you know, things that prevent heart disease, etc. all of the time. So we had to fight for it because it's a thing that is viewed to be, you know, only affecting a certain small community. Somehow it was the state funding of people being promiscuous, which was ridiculous going forward. But now we've only made it available in those sexual health clinics which we already know are disproportionately used by women and people of colour. And if you do find it, it's only in an urban area. It's normally the dirty secret of the hospital. You have to go down a corridor, round, up, you know, it's like we've kind of put it on the top shelf and above. And we're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe people don't know about this amazing way that you can stop yourself getting HIV. And it's like, we had a 3-year trial for PrEP. Only 4% of people were not gay or bisexual men on that trial. Half of those were trans. You know, it's like, and we're not, you know, it's appalling, but the government have kind of actively hidden it out the way. So it's not surprising the message hasn't got out wider.
Richard, that's an idea. I was going to say, what should we be doing to follow up on that? You've just given us a good idea. The hiding PrEP down the weird corridor, around the corner, up on the back shelf, and you know, knock 3 times and say the magic word, and then you might be able to get it. Is a good idea. We are at pretty much the end. Yes, just 1 minute over.
Can I give you one? Can I give you 2 more then?
Yes, do please. Yeah, quickly.
One, the stigma that's latent, not just in our hearts and minds, but still in our policy. So if we got rid of the gay blood ban rules recently, but there still is a rule that if you have had sex in the last 3 months with somebody who's ever had sex, basically in Africa, you can't give blood. And it is so discriminatory as a rule. It's not an effective public health prevention, but it's still on the statute books. It got deleted back in June in Scotland and Wales, but they've kept it here in England. You still can't serve in the armed forces if you're living with HIV pre-joining. And if you get diagnosed in the service, you have to get special dispensation, which basically means very few people get a HIV test in the service. You can't go through surrogacy, even though you can't pass on the virus if you're on effective treatment. And most of the global boxing rules mean that you have to have a HIV test before you fight, and you can't do that. But there is no way that by boxing you can have HIV transmission. So there's latent stigma rules that are out there that we need our friends in the media to help us knock down at every stage to work through on this issue. So help us raise the testing, help us fight the stigma, and together we can hopefully be part of this amazing achievement that our country goes through.
Brilliant, Richard. Thank you so much. You've given us tons of ideas, and definitely focuses the mind on how it still matters. Thank you very much to everybody who joined us from JENGbA, obviously to John, whose story is extraordinary in the podcast and beautifully told by Dave, to Jan we heard from, to Charlotte, who's pulling up trees, and I'm going to upgrade to a first, I think, and we can all agree from this jury, we would vote for that. To everybody who's joined in the chat as well, to John Alexander we saw, and everybody who's joined in here, it's been lovely to have you all. Tomorrow evening it is Azim Azar with a cast of blooming thousands, so we're looking forward to that. Thank you so much. Have a nice evening. Bye.